doing with the mic? Better. Okay. Some of you know this. When I was 11 years old, my family moved from El Paso to Los Angeles. It was a business move for my dad, and I will never forget the summer we moved to LA. I'll never forget one Sunday. It was a beautiful day. It was a sunny day. And we all dressed up for church, as people did in those days. And I still remember I had on those classic gray slacks, white shirt, tie, blue blazer. And at church, I fit in absolutely perfectly because everybody had gray slacks on, a blue blazer, a white shirt, and a tie. And when the service ended, my folks thought it would be fun to take all of us to a restaurant on a beach in Santa Monica. And while the meal was fine, what happened afterward still scars me to this day. You see, my folks dragged us out of the restaurant after lunch, out onto the beach for a walk. It was summer, it was hot, it was 1971. There were bikinis and tanned lifeguards and surfers. And I was in a blazer and tie, for goodness sake. Not cool. I was horrified. I felt like a total geek and nerd. And as I walked along the sand, I thought, what must these people be thinking about me? For sure, now they know I'm from Texas. Now, for those of you that may be visiting from Texas, I'm a native Texan, so I'm simply poking fun at myself with this. But I did think at the time, who else walks on the beach in the middle of summer with a coat and tie on? I mean, that's just crazy. I'm not sure I felt ever more out of place in my life, more out of sync with everyone else, and more uncomfortable. When reflecting back on that day so long ago, it seems to me that it's actually a pretty apt metaphor for something that is far more significant. You see, I believe in America right now, like a kid walking on the beach in a tie, it's beginning to feel like Christians are becoming far and few between. We're a minority in this country and outside of the norm in many places, especially Pitkin County. And we are dealing with cultural demands that make us different from most people if we take our faith seriously. Even when you say the name Jesus, some people will look at you like those bikini-clad bodies looked at me on Santa Monica Beach 42 years ago. Our Christian walk is not an easy one these days. There are lots of outside challenges. There's a lot of pressure, I believe, in America not to be Christian. And in many spots, to be Christian is not only uncool, but thought by a lot of people to reflect narrow-mindedness or closed thinking or an antiquated, non-scientific worldview. Well, that said, there are some other things that make our walk with Christ difficult. And these are things that come not from external sources like our culture, but these are things that come from within ourselves that make it hard to walk with Christ. From deep within, from who we are as people. Things like trying always to be in control of our lives, or assuming that there's something we can actually do to earn God's love or grace or forgiveness or favor. But today I want to focus on something else that comes from within us that makes our walk with Christ harder. Something that many of us struggle with, including me. Something that lots of us do that makes it harder to be faithful to Jesus and can get in the way, I believe, of what our Christian faith is ultimately about. Now, before I get started with this message this morning, I must say that for some, including me, this can be kind of a shift in your seat message. What I want to talk about today may not be the most comfortable thing to hear. It's hard to hear. It's not easy to think about. And I want to be clear that I preach this message with no condemnation or criticism of others. This is something that I struggle with in my life. And frankly, I'll probably struggle with it for the rest of my life. And to help us get at what I want to get into, I'd like for a moment to turn to two cultural traditions that are very distinct from our own. And despite the fact that these traditions are very distinct from our own, I think that they're compelling and they are instructive. The first tradition comes from a Shinto shrine in Japan. and you may know this. It's a shrine that is architecturally very simple, but because of its simplicity, it is a beautiful structure. But what is amazing to me is that this shrine is intentionally torn down totally and completely every 20 years. And then every 20 years, they build a new shrine on an adjacent site. This has been going on for 1,300 years. Just think, this sacred building is destroyed every 20 years. And it's based on the Shinto belief that nothing in life is permanent. Then there's the ancient Buddhist tradition I've mentioned before, of creating the sand mandala, the practice where monks get together and they use colored sand and they make these extraordinary pieces of art out of colored sand. And after people have had a little bit of time to take them in and look at them, what do? They ceremonially destroy these magnificent pieces of art based on the Buddhist belief that everything in life is transitory. Now, you all know me well enough. I'm neither Shinto nor Buddhist. I don't believe in any way, shape, or form that all faith traditions are the same. I'm absolutely a committed follower of Christ. Yet, I believe that these two little tidbits are quite instructive for us who believe in Jesus and believe that Jesus is Lord. You see, over the years in ministry, I've come to the painful recognition, and I've suffered because of it, and suffered sometimes at the hands of others because of it, that sometimes we make our faith far too complicated, far too cumbersome, and frequently we add on things that get in the way of our ability to follow Jesus faithfully and passionately. And much of what we tend to add on to our faith or our faith practices is impermanent to begin with, and in fact can lead us away from the one thing that is permanent, which is Christ. Too often, sadly and tragically, I have seen in communities of faith divisions and upset caused by a passion for what is impermanent and too little of a focus on Jesus himself. And frequently it is these add-ons that mess people up and end up destroying communities of faith. I've seen it in many. Not here, thank God. And so for a few moments this morning, I'd like to explore some things that I call faith add-ons, supplements, if you will. Now, before I start, I must say, and I want you to hear me say, that the things that I'm talking about, although while I'm calling them add-ons, that there's nothing inherently bad or negative about them. They can be wonderful blessings. They can be significant aids to our journey with Jesus. But that said, they can distract us from Jesus, make things far too complicated, and in fact end up making us more unfaithful than people who have no faith at all. We can end up worshiping and being devoted more to these add-ons than to God and what God is calling us to do. So let's start with the add-on of tradition. Remember, I come from the Episcopal tradition. I'm still an Episcopal priest, still tied to the Diocese of New York. You all know that. It's a beautiful tradition. It's a meaningful tradition. It's something that's gone on for generations. But I have been in many Episcopal churches that the prayer book, the hymnal, and how people have done it for generations becomes far more important than Jesus, and in fact become the objects of worship themselves. Sometimes clergy are the worst offenders. Robes and titles and ways of genuflecting become the measure of faithfulness. Jesus had a lot to say about that. And it's not that robes and titles are intrinsically bad. I like robes and stoles. It's just we need to be careful how they are viewed and how those who are wearing such things are responded to. And speaking of tradition, in a previous parish I served as rector, I actually had members of the choir, Paul and I have talked about this, members of the choir say, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Why does Robert talk so much about Jesus? What's his problem? Doesn't he realize there's more to it than that? People need to learn the prayer book. And the way we've been doing things in this parish for 200 years. Now, just in case You think I'm reserving my comments for one kind of tradition. It's important to point out that I know people who believe that if worship is not contemporary and with a large screen with bouncing words, that somehow God is not being worshipped faithfully. And the ironic thing is that current contemporary trends will themselves become viewed as traditional in years to come, and I believe that many will fall into the trap of worshiping the band more than Jesus. Now I want to be clear again. Tradition, however it's defined, contemporary or 500 years old, is not bad. It's important. They can aid us in profound ways in our walk with Christ. But that said, again and again and again, and it breaks my heart, I have found places in which tradition becomes more important than Christ. Lest we forget, tradition changes. And everything that is traditional is impermanent. And sadly, if we were not really cautious, we will be led away from the one thing that is permanent, which is God himself. So aside from tradition, let me spend a moment and talk about buildings. I am very intrigued by the Shinto practice of taking down sacred spaces every 20 years. I know lots of places that need to be taken down. We are so incredibly blessed. I can't tell you what a delight it is to be in a place where our building is just 25 years old. That is just an awesome thing. We avoid so many issues and upsets and turmoils and divisions and factions because of this. I served as rector in a building that was 250 years old. If I wanted to move a chair, there was a riot. The structure becomes bigger than God, and people sometimes come to depend on, and this is what is disturbing to me and upsetting, is people can come to depend on place more than relationship. Again, it's not that the buildings are bad in and of themselves. I love buildings. I love cathedrals. But they can become so easily objects of worship. And then aside from the add-ons of tradition to buildings, there's the entire issue of rules. Religious rules. Now, I'm all for rules. I'm all for the Sabbath day. But when Jesus was around, you know that it was those who put rules ahead of God that crucified him? They actually believed that Jesus ignored rules. He didn't ignore rules. He went to the heart of what the rules represented. Jesus didn't blow the rules off. It's just that he put God first, ahead of the rules. You remember the stories. They're all over the Gospels. Remember Luke chapter 13. Jesus heals a crippled woman on a Sabbath day. This woman has been crippled. And the religious leaders, the Gospels tell us, are not just upset, they're indignant. They put the rules ahead of God. Same thing happens in Mark chapter 3 when Jesus heals a man with a shriveled hand. They're furious, the religious leaders. And then there's the time described in Matthew in which Jesus and his followers eat the wrong thing in the wrong way on the Sabbath. And then I will remember, same choir, Paul, them being very upset because I seem to have humor in church. Now again, just to emphasize, rules are necessary and important, and they are integral to life, and I am a big rule follower. I try to be. But let us not forget that the religious rules can become the object of our adoration. Sabbath ahead of God. Now I believe that it's our nature to add things onto our faith, into our faith practices, just a few of which I've named, that aren't central to our walk with Christ. Again, just so I'm not misquoted, I want to be very clear. The things that I've mentioned are not bad in and of themselves. But they can cause us to worship, adore, praise, and rely on things other than God. Now, Paul, if you think about it, had a lot to say about this in his letter to the Philippians. Listen from one version of the Bible. Listen carefully to what Paul wrote in the context of what I've just said. Here's what Paul writes. You know my pedigree, a legitimate birth, circumcised on the 8th day, an Israelite from the elite tribe of Benjamin, a strict and devout adherent in God's law, a fiery defender of the purity of my religion, even to the point of persecuting Christians, a meticulous observer of everything set down in God's law book. Yet these very credentials I am tearing up and throwing out with the trash, along with everything else I used to believe was important. And why? Because of Jesus Christ. Yes, all things I once thought were so important are gone. I'm not saying I have it all together, that I haven't made, but I am well on my way for reaching out for Christ, who has so wondrously reached out for me. I'm off and running and not turning back. Powerful words. Think of what Paul shed to come up and come to that place of faith. And if Paul were to write Christians in America a letter today, I think that he would say something like this. I think what he would say is something like this. I think he'd say, when it's all said and done, remember that what ultimately matters the most is our relationship with Christ. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is relatively unimportant. Ways of doing things, religious rules, ways of worshiping, clergy roles, traditions, whether ancient or contemporary, place, structures, buildings, artwork, songs, hymns, bands, candles, stained glass windows, screens, no screens, hands in the air, hands to the side, loud, soft, tall spires, organs, auditoriums, the King James Bible, the Message, the NIV, Lutheran, Baptist, Catholic, non-denominational. All of this stuff, absolutely all of it and more, is totally secondary to our relationship with Christ. And he would write, I believe, everything but Jesus is temporary, and everything that is temporary can get in the way of our relationship with Christ. And what he is calling us to do, if we are not vigilant, careful, prayerful, and attentive to our own inner stuff and histories. But there's more to what Paul says. Remember, in his letter, and I find this to be quite relieving, he says he doesn't have this whole Jesus' primary thing down pat. And I'm glad. And while he understands that Jesus is primary and everything else is secondary, he says that it's a journey. It's a long one. It's a lifelong journey. But it's his goal, and it's his objective, and it's what he presses on to accomplish. I recently read a book, maybe some of you have read it, titled Love Does by Bob Goff. And there's a tiny little phrase in a very short chapter that gets me. Bob writes, it's a matter of the heart. You see, in the end, for me it is Jesus plus nothing. What a great phrase to ponder and to think about. Jesus plus nothing. Nothing really else ultimately matters. Jesus without the add-ons. And what I think he's saying is that it's Jesus with no add-ons that matters the most. And my hunch is that, like Paul, Bob, who wrote that phrase, is still on that journey. I know, for one, that I have some faith add-ons. I know, for one, that when you get right down to it, there are things in my faith journey that are really not all that important compared to God. Things that are ultimately inconsequential and impermanent. Now, I'm very happy, in a big cathedral with robes and incense and the whole 9 yards. I'm just delighted to be in that setting. I'm also happy, though, to be in a strip mall with a praise band led by a guy in a Hawaiian shirt. But that said, there are other things I know I add on to my relationship with Christ that are much harder for me to let go of. And it's going to be my life journey tackling those things. So in conclusion, I pray over the days ahead, and especially in this season of Lent in which we are called to turn back, to repent, to turn back to God, that we'll all spend some time thinking about Jesus, that we'll ponder what our add-ons are. You see, I don't know of a soul who lives without them. And so the question is not whether or not you have them, but rather to get clear on what they are. And finally, please keep in mind that this stuff that I'm talking about today is really hard. It's not easy. This is tough stuff. This is rubber meets the road faith stuff. Please remember, too, that regardless of where you are in your faith journey and making Jesus alone primary, that he loves you and adores you anyway. And finally, remember that as a Christian, now listen to this, as a Christian, if you end up sometimes feeling like a kid on a beach in the summer in a coat and tie, compared to everyone else out there, you are actually probably getting a lot closer to living for the goal of Jesus plus.